Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today! Last time, I tried out the 1968 Dodge Charger with 1200 horsepower. This time, a car I've almost never driven, the 2002 NSX Type R. I love this car, but for whatever reason, I've never really spent much time with it in Gran Turismo 7. Cue the engine swap. So the engine in question is from the Super GT NSX, a 2-litre turbo 4-cylinder that sounds just as soulless as most other turbo 4s from the last 10 years. But, coming from a Group 2 car, it can be upgraded to over 800 horsepower and weighs about 100 kilograms less than the stock V6. Should be a recipe for disaster. As usual, I'm starting out with all of the Go Faster bits glued on, but I've made no tweaks to the customizable parts. The only thing I've done is max out the downforce, as many players often do. The car has a wonderful livery that adds 100 horsepower, some fancy wheels downsized to 16 inches, a front splitter, rear diffuser, and the only available wing option, which gives us a slight problem, which I'll explain later. For now, let's see how quickly the NSX tries to remove me from existence. The test track today is Grand Valley South, using the Japanese Clubman Cup to earn myself some doubloons to pay off the 12 mortgages I took out for the engine swap. With no tweaks to the settings, the NSX is truly unique, in that it is both surprisingly easy to drive, but at the same time completely terrifying. It wobbles and lumbers all over the place, but when it does start to slide, the car can actually be caught, which is shocking. The trouble is, eventually the car can't be caught, and you make a right pillock of yourself. As usual, the first adjustments I made were to the anti-roll bars and natural frequency, hoping that reducing the body roll would keep the car more stable. At first, I thought the car had improved. On low-speed corners, the car felt more predictable since it wasn't moving around quite so much. But then I reached a higher speed corner that involved braking while turning, and it all went a bit downhill. The car is quite honestly worse. So we need to keep tweaking to see if we can rescue it. Next up, I adjusted the differential. Increasing initial torque generally makes a car more numb and feel less responsive, which should help here. And decreasing acceleration sensitivity will make the inside wheel get more power than the outside wheel in a corner, which generally makes the car more predictable. This did not have the desired effect. I increased compression, which generally doesn't do much. I've experimented with damping ratio, and usually having low values makes the car slightly less predictable on racing tyres. Next, I reduced camber, like I usually do, hoping that it would make the car less twitchy. Clearly, this didn't help much, since I suffered from a tank slapper on lap 1 which sent me into the pit lane. So, the most obvious thing all along was the downforce, and this is where that problem I mentioned with the rear wing comes in. The car comes with downforce from the factory, and it can have a front splitter and rear diffuser. This means the car is capable of some very impressive front downforce. However, the rear wing option is limited to a quote-unquote type spoiler that's unique to this car. Imagine the DTM style wing on the BMW E36 M3, or the ducktail you can fit to various JDM cars, or the unique wings on hatchbacks. These don't add as much downforce as the custom wing sets where you can choose the size and the shape of the winglets. This means that the rear downforce can't be set high enough to balance out the front downforce. I'm taking a very scenic route to the point here, but the short version is that we need to reduce the front downforce. In general, we want the front downforce set at least 100 points lower than the rear on road cars. Here, I reduce it further to help with stability. And finally, all of those other tweaks have combined with the downforce adjustments to make a car that doesn't slingshot you into the nearest morgue. Reducing the front downforce now keeps the rear end stable enough at high speed for all of the other adjustments to work, which were only helping at low speed before. Before I do the obligatory lap of the Nordschleife, one interesting thing to note on the NSX is the gearing. Cars in Gran Turismo 7 have a drag statistic that we can't see, which affects the top speed. Take for example the Demon Charger from the previous video. It has almost 1200 horsepower, but it only has a top speed of about 225 miles per hour with the wings attached, because this engine swap is a bit like strapping a solid rocket booster to a shed. It's very powerful, but the shape causes a lot of drag. Now have a look at the NSX, which has almost 400 horsepower less, yet sails to 260 miles per hour, because the car's shape attacks the air like I attack a Yorkshire pudding. So because this car has such a high potential top speed, the gears need to be spaced very widely indeed. This can also help with more predictable power delivery if the first few gears are widely spaced. You may have noticed earlier in the video that the car would wheel spin in 4th gear, where if we space out the gears, you'll only get wheel spin in 1st and 2nd. When adjusting gear ratios, it's best to set the top speed first, and then go into the individual adjustments afterwards. So, I tried the Nurburgring with the current setup. Usually we find the car uncontrollable and end up having to add a ton of ballast weight, but the NSX seemed to be handling itself okay. It did feel slightly twitchy, but not as difficult to manage as the 930 Turbo for example. That was until I reached just before the Mutt curve, and the car bit me in the arse. I've most definitely been killed after that one. So, to make the car more reasonable on a track like this, I added 130 kilograms of ballast weight slightly towards the front axle. This sounds like a lot, but then the car still weighs only 1,000 kilos or 2,200 pounds with the weight added on, so it's still much lighter than the other monsters in this series so far. Adding the weight slightly to the front will help with potential lift-off oversteer and general stability, but keeping 55% of the bias to the rear will keep semi-decent traction out of corners. If all of this weight was added to the front axle, the car would be more prone to wheel spin, which would cancel out the improvements to lift-off oversteer. I've also reduced the natural frequency so that the car can handle the curbs more easily, since they were causing some fairly dramatic course alterations. I would probably recommend this setup on all tracks, since the car doesn't really seem to be any faster without the weight added on. Adding ballast basically gives you better consistency with no penalty to lap time, whilst also reducing the performance point rating. Win-win. Back into the forest and the car handles much more nicely. It still keeps you on your toes, but generally behaves as you would expect it to. Much like with all of the monsters I try to tame, there are setups out there that will make these cars faster, but I'm not talented enough to extract that level of performance, and there's a lot of people in the same boat. So these setups are aimed at making the performance of these kinds of cars accessible to those of us who just want to enjoy these wacky machines without being decapitated. In the end, the Honda NSX achieved a 6 minutes 16 lap, making it the fastest monster so far, but only just. So, that was another attempt to tame a monster. I hope my advice and settings helped. If you have any requests for any others you want to see tamed, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and if you're feeling like a particularly friendly little osprey, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care, and ta-ra. Shit.